May 27th, 1944. Dover, England. 14:30 hours. Lieutenant Colonel David Strangeways stands on the white cliffs, binoculars pressed to his face, watching the German reconnaissance aircraft make its fifth pass of the day. The Luftwaffe Ju-88 maintains 22,000 feet, well beyond effective anti-aircraft range, its cameras clicking away at the massive military build-up below. Strangeways can see what the German pilots see: hundreds of tanks arrayed in neat rows, artillery pieces positioned for embarkation, landing craft crowding the harbour, supply dumps stretching for miles, an invasion force pointing directly at Calais, just 21 miles across the Channel, the largest concentration of military power ever assembled on British soil. Strangeways lowers his binoculars and checks his watch. The German aircraft will be back in France within 40 minutes. Photo interpreters at Luftwaffe Reconnaissance Headquarters will have developed prints within 2 hours. Intelligence summaries will reach German 15th Army Headquarters at Calais by evening. General Hans von Salmuth, commanding 19 divisions defending the Pas de Calais, will review the latest confirmation that the Allied invasion will strike his sector. He will maintain his forces in position, continue fortifying the obvious landing beaches, keep his panzer reserves close to Calais rather than dispersing them along 500 miles of French coast. What von Salmuth doesn't know, what his photo interpreters can't detect from 22,000 feet, what his intelligence officers won't discover until months after the war ends, is that every tank, every artillery piece, every landing craft visible in those reconnaissance photographs is inflatable, made of rubber and canvas. The largest military build-up the German pilot has just photographed consists of approximately $80,000 worth of balloons. The 150,000 troops of Lieutenant General George S. Patton's 1st U.S. Army Group, designated FUSAG, don't exist. The combat divisions, the supply units, the headquarters staff, the tank regiments, the artillery battalions, the airborne divisions visible through German reconnaissance, detectable through radio intercepts, confirmed through agent reports, all of it is fiction. Britain has discovered something profound about modern warfare. In an age of long-range reconnaissance and signals intelligence, perception can be manufactured as precisely as ammunition. And manufactured perception, if maintained systematically and confirmed through multiple independent sources, becomes indistinguishable from reality to an enemy analyst working from fragmented information. The deception operation unfolding across southeastern England in May 1944 represents the largest, most complex, most successful strategic deception in military history. Operation Fortitude, the Allied effort to mislead German intelligence about D-Day's location, timing and scale, will keep 7 German divisions and 2 panzer divisions frozen at Calais for 7 critical weeks after Allied forces land 200 miles away at Normandy. These 150,000 German troops, positioned to defend against inflatable tanks commanded by a fictional army group, will sit idle while real American, British and Canadian forces fight to expand the Normandy beachhead. The cost-effectiveness of this deception defies conventional military mathematics. Fewer than £100,000 worth of rubber, canvas, wood and radio equipment will paralyze combat forces, representing over $2 billion of German military investment. The strategic impact will prove decisive. On June 6, 1944, Allied forces will land at Normandy against lighter resistance than anticipated. German reinforcements that could have been deployed within hours will remain at Calais, waiting for Patton's Phantom Army. By the time German intelligence confirms the deception, Allied forces will have established an unbreakable foothold in France. The liberation of Western Europe will proceed from a beachhead that survived its first critical days because Germany defended against armies that didn't exist, while real armies landed where Germany wasn't prepared. The story of how Britain manufactured fake armies faster and more convincingly than Germany could deploy real ones begins not with inflatable tanks or fake radio traffic, but with understanding how military intelligence actually functions. The gap between what analysts can observe and what commanders need to know creates vulnerability to systematic deception. British intelligence officers, many of whom had worked in advertising, entertainment, and journalism before the war, understood that intelligence analysis relies on interpreting fragments of information rather than observing complete truth. A photograph showing tanks in a field doesn't reveal whether those tanks are functional, whether they're crewed, whether they have fuel and ammunition, whether they're part of a coherent military unit, or simply equipment awaiting disposition. Analysts must infer these details from context, from patterns, from correlating multiple information sources. British deception planners, organised under the London Controlling Section and the 20 Committee, realised that if they could feed German intelligence a coherent narrative supported by multiple independent sources, that narrative would be accepted as fact. A fake tank becomes real if reconnaissance photographs confirm its presence, if radio traffic discusses its movement, if agent reports describe troops servicing it, if ultra-intercepts reveal that German intelligence has logged its existence. The British called this approach strategic deception. The Germans, who discovered its full scope only after their defeat, had no term for it because they had never encountered anything like it in military history. The foundation of Operation Fortitude was laid years before D-Day through Britain's counterintelligence triumph in turning every German spy operating on British soil. The 20 Committee, named for the Roman numerals 20 suggesting double cross, had identified and captured every German agent who reached Britain. Some were executed. Most were offered the choice between cooperation or execution. Every surviving German agent in Britain was working for British intelligence by 1943, sending carefully crafted messages back to their German handlers, messages that contained truth mixed with fiction in proportions calculated to build credibility while advancing British strategic goals. Agent Garbo, real name Juan Pujol Garcia, represented the pinnacle of this system. A Spaniard who desperately wanted to fight fascism, Pujol had approached British intelligence with an offer to spy for them inside Germany. British intelligence, displaying the bureaucratic myopia that characterized their early war performance, rejected him. Undeterred, Pujol approached German intelligence and convinced them to recruit him as a spy in Britain. Without ever visiting Britain, operating from Lisbon with a tourist guidebook and railway timetable, Pujol manufactured elaborate reports about British military activities, inventing a network of fictional sub-agents who supposedly provided his intelligence. German intelligence, desperate for information about Britain, accepted Pujol's reports as genuine. They paid him substantial sums. They requested specific intelligence on military matters. Pujol's fictional reports became so convincing that British counterintelligence, monitoring German intelligence communications through Ultra, realized the Germans were relying on a source they couldn't identify. When British intelligence finally tracked Pujol to Lisbon and discovered what he was doing, they realized they had found something extraordinary. Not a spy, but a performance artist whose medium was intelligence fabrication. In April 1942, British intelligence brought Pujol to Britain and gave him the code name Garbo, after the actress, because he was the best actor in the world. Under British control, Pujol expanded his fictional network to 27 sub-agents, each with distinct personalities, occupations, and areas of expertise. These imaginary people filed reports that German intelligence cross-referenced, verified through other sources, and incorporated into their intelligence assessments. By 1944, Garbo was Germany's most trusted source on British activities. German intelligence awarded him the Iron Cross, never knowing he was British-controlled. The British later awarded him an MBE. Garbo remains the only person decorated by both sides in World War II. Operation Fortitude required selling German intelligence on two massive deceptions simultaneously. Fortitude. North convinced Germany that Allied forces would invade Norway, tying down 27 German divisions that could have been deployed to France. Fortitude South, the more elaborate and ultimately more consequential operation, convinced Germany that the main Allied invasion would strike the Pas de Calais, not Normandy. Both deceptions relied on the same fundamental technique: create a fictional military force, support its existence through multiple information channels, and maintain the deception until the enemy commits real resources to counter the imaginary threat. Fortitude South's centerpiece was the 1st U.S. Army Group, FUSAG, supposedly commanded by Lieutenant General George S. Patton and comprising 12 divisions preparing to invade at Calais. The entire Army Group was fictional. Patton was real and was allowed to be seen at FUSAG headquarters, lending credibility to the deception. But the troops, the equipment, the operational plans, everything else about FUSAG existed only in German intelligence files. Creating a fictional army required attention to detail that would satisfy professional intelligence analysts. Every military unit generates specific intelligence signatures. Radio traffic follows predictable patterns based on organization and mission. Supply requirements scale with unit size and equipment type. Personnel movements create observable patterns. Reconnaissance can detect equipment, facilities, and activity levels. Agent networks can observe troop presence, unit insignia, officer identities, and operational preparations. A convincing fake army must produce all these signatures in patterns that match what analysts expect from a real force. The physical elements of the deception were constructed by British engineers and film professionals who approached the problem as a special effects challenge. The key insight was that German reconnaissance aircraft operated at altitudes between 20,000 and 30,000 feet to avoid anti-aircraft fire. At that altitude, photograph resolution limited what could be distinguished. A real tank and an inflatable replica would produce identical photographic signatures if the replica matched the tank's dimensions, general configuration, and shadow characteristics. The inflatable tanks and equipment were manufactured by British companies including Shepperton Studios, normally engaged in film production. Each inflatable Sherman tank measured 19 feet 2 inches long, 8 feet 7 inches wide, and 9 feet tall, matching the M4 Sherman's external dimensions precisely. The inflatables were constructed from rubberized canvas stretched over internal frames, with external details painted to simulate hatches, vision ports, gun barrels, and tracks. Weight was approximately 100 pounds per unit, light enough for 4 men to carry while deflated and position while inflated. The cost comparison between real and fake equipment revealed the deception's economic efficiency. A real M4 Sherman tank in 1944 cost approximately $50,000 to manufacture, required months of production time, consumed steel, aluminum, rubber, and precision components, demanded skilled labor, and required continuous maintenance, fuel, ammunition, and spare parts. An inflatable Sherman cost approximately $150 to manufacture, required days to produce, consumed primarily rubber and canvas, needed minimal skilled labor, and required only occasional patching and an air pump for maintenance. The cost ratio was 333 to 1. $1 invested in fake tanks provided the equivalent strategic impact of $333 invested in real tanks, provided the enemy believed they were real. The inflation process for a typical decoy tank took 4 men approximately 15 minutes using portable air pumps. Once inflated, the tanks were positioned in tactical formations that reconnaissance would expect to observe. British engineers studied actual tank parking patterns from real units, replicating the spacing, orientation, and protective dispersal that combat units would employ. They added realistic details. Tracks were carved into the ground, approaching each tank position to simulate vehicle movement. Camouflage netting was positioned imperfectly, as real crews would do it. Maintenance crews were simulated during daylight hours, when German reconnaissance was most likely. Soldiers were positioned near the tanks in numbers consistent with armor unit organization. The attention to detail extended beyond the equipment itself. Real armored units generate environmental signatures visible from aerial reconnaissance. Vehicle movement churns soil, creating distinctive patterns. Repeated traffic creates road networks connecting positions. Supply activities produce characteristic disturbances. Maintenance operations leave specific traces. British engineers replicated all of these signatures. They drove trucks in patterns that would create the road networks an armoured division would generate. They placed dummy supply dumps in locations consistent with armour unit logistics. They positioned fake maintenance facilities where real units would establish them. By late May 1944, southeastern England hosted approximately 400 inflatable tanks, 250 inflatable artillery pieces, dozens of inflatable landing craft, and hundreds of inflatable trucks and support vehicles. The total cost was under $100,000. German reconnaissance photographed these installations repeatedly, documenting what appeared to be the largest concentration of military power in Britain, all positioned for an obvious strike at Calais. But visual deception alone would not convince professional intelligence analysts. German intelligence would cross-reference reconnaissance photography with signals intelligence, agent reports, and captured documents. Fortitude required these multiple sources to corroborate each other, creating a web of mutually supporting evidence that appeared impossible to fabricate. The radio deception component of Fortitude South was assigned to British signals specialists who understood how military units communicate. Every military formation generates characteristic radio traffic patterns. A division headquarters communicates with brigade headquarters, which communicate with battalion headquarters, which communicate with company commanders. The volume, frequency, timing, and content of these communications follow predictable patterns based on unit size, mission, and operational tempo. German signals intelligence, which maintained extensive monitoring stations along the French coast, would detect and analyze Allied radio traffic, using it to confirm or refute intelligence from other sources. British signals specialists created fictional radio networks that mimicked real military communications. They established fake headquarters stations that transmitted traffic patterns matching what a real army group would generate. They created fake subordinate units that communicated with these headquarters using proper military protocols, call signs, and encryption procedures. The volume of traffic was calibrated to match what German analysts would expect from the fictional unit's supposed size and activity level. The content of these transmissions was carefully crafted. Some messages were encrypted using codes the British knew German intelligence had broken, ensuring the Germans could read selected communications. Other messages were sent in codes too secure to break, creating intelligence gaps that would seem natural and forcing German analysts to infer information, making them complicit in confirming the deception. The messages discussed realistic military matters, training exercises, equipment maintenance, personnel issues, logistical preparations, operational planning at appropriate security levels. Nothing dramatic or obviously significant, just the routine communications that real units would generate. British radio operators became actors performing their roles across hundreds of hours of broadcasts. They developed distinct operating styles, what signals intelligence calls a radio operator's fist, the unique characteristics of how an individual sends Morse code. German signals intelligence maintained files on Allied radio operators, tracking them across postings and using their presence to confirm unit locations. British operators maintained these fictional identities consistently, creating personnel histories that German files would track and verify. The coordination required for this radio deception was extraordinary. Dozens of transmitting stations scattered across southeastern England had to maintain consistent traffic patterns for months. The networks had to evolve realistically as the fictional FUSAG prepared for invasion. Training phase communications differed from operational preparation phase communications, which differed from pre-invasion communications. British signals specialists created timelines for each fictional unit, planning how their communications would evolve as D-Day approached, ensuring German analysts tracking these patterns would observe the predictable progression of a real force preparing for major operations. The agent network deception was perhaps the most delicate element of fortitude. Garbo and other double agents had to report observations consistent with reconnaissance photography and signals intelligence while avoiding information specific enough to allow German analysts to identify fabrication. An agent reporting that they observed tanks in a specific location helped confirm reconnaissance photography. An agent reporting specific unit designations, commanding officer names, or equipment serial numbers risked providing details that might not match other intelligence sources, potentially exposing the deception. British controllers fed their double agents carefully calibrated information. Some reports contained accurate details about real units, building agent credibility. Other reports contained information about fictional FUSAG units, presented as observations rather than confirmed facts. Agent reports created human texture that photography and signals intelligence couldn't provide. They described soldier morale, unit readiness, logistical challenges, training problems, the kind of ground-level detail that commanders value because it reveals operational status beyond what headquarters reports contain. Garbo's network filed reports describing FUSAG divisions arriving in southeast England. Sub-agents supposedly observed troops wearing specific unit insignia, witnessed training exercises consistent with amphibious assault preparation, overheard soldiers discussing operations in ways that suggested Calais as the target without explicitly stating it. The reports accumulated detail incrementally, building a picture that seemed impossible to fabricate because of its consistency across multiple observers, its correlation with other intelligence sources, and its conformity to German expectations about Allied invasion planning. The deception planners understood that German intelligence would apply systematic analysis to evaluate the FUSAG threat. They anticipated specific intelligence questions German analysts would ask and ensured Fortitude provided answers that confirmed FUSAG's reality. Where would FUSAG headquarters be located? The British established a real headquarters facility at Wentworth, staffed with enough personnel to generate appropriate activity levels visible to reconnaissance, identifiable through signals intelligence. Who commanded FUSAG? George S. Patton, whose presence was deliberately publicised, was photographed at the headquarters and whose radio communications were monitored by German signals intelligence. What units comprised FUSAG? The British created a detailed order of battle, listing specific divisions, their commanders, their equipment, and their locations, which agent networks reported and reconnaissance seemed to confirm. German intelligence, receiving information about FUSAG from multiple independent sources, concluded it was real. They had photographs showing equipment. They had signals intelligence showing communications networks. They had agent reports describing troop presence. They had no reason to suspect these sources were coordinated, much less that Britain had created an entire intelligence environment designed to deceive. The very complexity of such an operation seemed impossible to execute and impossible to maintain across months without exposure through some error or inconsistency. What German intelligence couldn't know was that Britain had created an unprecedented intelligence monitoring capability that allowed real-time observation of whether the deception was working. Ultra, the code name for signals intelligence derived from breaking German military codes, gave British intelligence something approaching telepathy. They could read German high command communications, intelligence assessments, operational orders, everything transmitted using the Enigma cipher system that Germany believed was unbreakable. Ultra's value for Fortitude was transformative. British deception planners could observe German intelligence conclusions about FUSAG almost as quickly as German commanders received them. When German intelligence filed reports confirming FUSAG's presence in southeast England, British intelligence read these reports. When German commands deployed forces to counter FUSAG, British intelligence read the deployment orders. When German intelligence requested additional information about specific aspects of FUSAG, British intelligence read these requests and adjusted agent reporting to provide the requested information, further confirming FUSAG's reality. This feedback loop allowed unprecedented refinement of the deception. If German intelligence expressed skepticism about some aspect of FUSAG, British deception planners could adjust their approach, providing additional confirmation through different sources. If German intelligence seemed satisfied with FUSAG intelligence and was basing operational plans on it, British planners knew the deception was succeeding and could maintain their current approach. Ultra-transformed strategic deception from guesswork into something approaching science, a systematic process of hypothesis testing where German responses provided immediate validation or disproof of deception tactics. The Germans, meanwhile, were making systematic intelligence mistakes that made them vulnerable to deception. German intelligence in 1944 suffered from institutional pathologies that prevented effective analysis. The split between military intelligence, the Abwehr, and political intelligence, the SD, created bureaucratic competition that prevented information sharing. The Nazi Party's ideological influence on intelligence assessment meant analysts faced pressure to confirm leadership preconceptions rather than provide objective evaluation. The German intelligence community's cultural assumptions about their enemies, particularly viewing allies as militarily inferior, created confirmation bias that made German analysts accept evidence supporting their prejudices while dismissing contradictory information. German intelligence also suffered from a fundamental methodological flaw. They had no effective counterintelligence screening of their agent networks. Unlike British intelligence, which systematically hunted enemy agents and maintained comprehensive control over information flowing to Germany, German intelligence accepted agent reports at face value, assuming their networks remained secure. The Abwehr had no idea that every agent operating in Britain was British-controlled. German intelligence believed they were receiving information from an extensive spy network when they were actually receiving carefully crafted deception from British intelligence. This counterintelligence failure meant German analysts were correlating information from sources they believed were independent, but were actually coordinated. When agent reports confirmed reconnaissance photography, German analysts saw independent verification. They didn't realize British intelligence had designed both sources to provide mutually supporting information. When signals intelligence matched agent observations, this seemed to prove both sources were accurate. The possibility that all sources might be controlled by British intelligence was considered so unlikely as to be effectively impossible. German photo-intelligence specialists at Luftwaffe Reconnaissance Headquarters analysed thousands of photographs of southeastern England during spring 1944. Their reports documented the massive build-up visible in the Dover-Folkestone area. They counted tanks, estimated division strengths, identified unit types, tracked movements, and provided German command with detailed intelligence on what appeared to be FUSAG's preparation for invasion. These analysts were professionals using sound analytical techniques. They understood photo interpretation, knew what military formations looked like from altitude, could distinguish equipment types, and could estimate unit strengths from observable signatures. Their mistake wasn't technical incompetence. It was assuming that what reconnaissance revealed represented reality rather than manufactured perception. At 20,000 feet altitude with photographic technology available in 1944, inflatable tanks were indistinguishable from real ones. The analysts saw what they expected to see and what every other intelligence source confirmed. Their conclusions were reasonable based on available evidence. The evidence itself was fiction. On the night of June 5, 1944, as Allied airborne forces began landing in Normandy to secure D-Day's flanks, German intelligence's confidence in Fortitude's deception reached its peak. German 15th Army at Calais maintained full readiness, anticipating the main Allied invasion imminently. General Hans von Salmuth, commanding 15th Army, had 19 divisions under his command, including 1st SS Panzer Corps with 2 elite armoured divisions. These forces represented over 150,000 troops, thousands of vehicles, hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces, positioned to defend the Pas de Calais against what they believed would be the war's decisive battle. At 6:30 hours on June 6th, Allied forces began landing at Normandy, 200 miles west of where von Salmuth's army waited. Initial German response was confused. Field Marshal Gerd von Rundstedt, commanding German forces in the west, believed Normandy might be a feint designed to draw reserves away from Calais before the main invasion struck. Ultra-intercepts revealed German high command, debating whether to commit reserves to Normandy or maintain them at Calais to face the larger threat they believed FUSAG represented. The argument within German command centered on a deceptively simple question. Was Normandy the main invasion, or was it preliminary to a larger operation at Calais? The question seemed important because it would determine German strategy. Commit reserves to Normandy, and they might repel the invasion, but leave Calais vulnerable to FUSAG. Hold reserves at Calais, and the Normandy invasion might establish an unbreakable beachhead. The debate consumed hours while Allied forces fought to expand beyond the beaches. What German commanders didn't know was that the question itself was the deception's final trap. There was no correct answer because the premise was false. FUSAG wasn't preparing to invade Calais. FUSAG didn't exist. The larger force that German intelligence tracked, that reconnaissance photographed, that agent networks reported, that justified holding 15th Army at Calais, was inflatable tanks and radio broadcasts. The strategic decision German command faced was between defending against a real threat and defending against balloons. The Germans chose to defend against the balloons. On June 6th, and for days after, 15th Army remained at Calais. Von Salmuth maintained his forces in defensive positions, waiting for FUSAG's assault. The panzer divisions that could have counterattacked at Normandy within hours of the landings stayed near Calais, postured to intercept Patton's Phantom Army. German intelligence continued filing reports confirming FUSAG's presence in southeast England, noting increased radio traffic suggesting imminent operations, reporting agent observations of final preparations for embarkation. British deception planners, reading these German intelligence assessments through Ultra, understood they had achieved something unprecedented in military history. They had paralyzed an entire German army using fake equipment and radio broadcasts. The cost of keeping 150,000 German troops and 2 panzer divisions idle at Calais for the critical first week of the Normandy invasion was under $100,000 in inflatable equipment, plus the operating costs of radio deception and agent network management. The strategic impact was measured in Allied lives saved and operational success. Military planners had estimated D-Day casualties at 10,000 to 12,000 killed on the beaches if German resistance was concentrated. Actual casualties were approximately 4,400 killed across all beaches, with many deaths occurring in the airborne operations rather than the beach landings. The lower casualties reflected multiple factors, including air and naval bombardment effectiveness, but the absence of German reserves that remained at Calais, waiting for FUSAG, was decisive. The panzer divisions held at Calais could have reached Normandy beaches on D-Day afternoon and might have driven Allied forces back into the sea before beachheads consolidated. Beyond casualties, the deception influenced operational tempo. By June 12th, Allied forces had landed over 326,000 troops, 54,000 vehicles, and 104,000 tons of supplies at Normandy. The build-up proceeded faster than planned because German counterattacks were weaker than anticipated. Forces that should have been attacking the beachhead were defending against armies that didn't exist. The lodgment that German strategic doctrine said could be contained only by immediate, overwhelming counterattack had solidified before German command recognized the Normandy landing was the main invasion. The deception's duration was remarkable. German intelligence didn't definitively conclude FUSAG was fictional until late July 1944, 7 weeks after D-Day. Throughout June and into July, German command believed Normandy might still be preliminary to a Calais invasion. Agent reports continued describing FUSAG activity. Radio traffic maintained operational patterns. Reconnaissance still photographed equipment in southeast England. The evidence supporting FUSAG's reality didn't disappear simply because Allied forces had landed at Normandy. German analysts assumed both operations could be real, that Allied deception might involve feinting at Calais to draw attention while actually invading Normandy, when the truth was simpler and more devastating. The Calais threat was entirely fictional, maintained to freeze German reserves while Normandy developed into an unstoppable offensive. When German intelligence finally confirmed FUSAG was a deception, the revelation produced what ultra-intercepts described as shock and recrimination within German high command. The realization that they had held back decisive reserves to defend against inflatable tanks, while real Allied armies carved through France, represented not just tactical defeat, but intellectual humiliation. Professional intelligence officers who had built careers on analytical rigor had been systematically deceived for months. The implications were profound and demoralizing. If Germany's intelligence services could be fooled this completely about something this important, what else might they be wrong about? How could commanders trust intelligence assessments when the assessment that had shaped their D-Day response was catastrophically incorrect? The mechanics of how FUSAG deception survived initial scrutiny and then continued deceiving German intelligence for weeks after D-Day revealed systematic weaknesses in German intelligence methodology. German analysts had committed what intelligence professionals call the confirmation bias trap. They had developed a hypothesis that Allied invasion would strike Calais based on logical analysis of geographic and strategic factors. The Pas de Calais offered the shortest channel crossing, was closest to Germany, provided the most direct route to the Ruhr industrial region, and offered excellent port facilities. From a strategic perspective, Calais was the obvious invasion point. Having formed this hypothesis, German intelligence interpreted evidence to confirm it, rather than test it. FUSAG's presence in southeast England confirmed their hypothesis, so they accepted FUSAG as real without subjecting that conclusion to rigorous skeptical analysis. They didn't ask hard questions about why reconnaissance could photograph so much equipment, but couldn't observe much activity. They didn't question why agent reports seemed too consistent, too supportive of the Calais hypothesis. They didn't consider whether the intelligence picture might be too coherent, too convenient, too perfectly aligned with their strategic expectations. British deception planners had understood this psychological vulnerability and exploited it ruthlessly. They fed German intelligence exactly what German analysts expected and wanted to find. The genius of fortitude wasn't creating impossible illusions. It was creating plausible illusions that confirmed German preconceptions. FUSAG looked real because it looked like what German analysts believed an invasion force preparing to strike Calais should look like. Every element of the deception was designed to match German expectations, ensuring analysts would fit observations into their existing analytical framework, rather than questioning whether that framework might be wrong. The technical execution of maintaining inflatable equipment installations for months demonstrated British attention to operational detail. The rubber and canvas decoys required maintenance to remain convincing under continued observation. Weather damage had to be repaired. Positions had to be adjusted periodically to simulate unit movements. New equipment had to be added as the fictional FUSAG supposedly received reinforcements. The logistics of this maintenance operation were substantial, requiring dedicated personnel, regular inspection schedules, and coordination with reconnaissance flight schedules to ensure German aircraft photographed installations when they appeared most convincing. British maintenance teams established routines based on German reconnaissance patterns. Luftwaffe reconnaissance aircraft operated on relatively predictable schedules, conducting systematic photographic coverage of Allied positions. British intelligence tracked these patterns through radar observations and signals intelligence. Maintenance teams scheduled their work to avoid exposure during likely reconnaissance windows. If German aircraft photographed installations at 1400 hours daily, British crews completed maintenance and position adjustments before 1200 hours, ensuring reconnaissance found everything properly positioned. The teams also added realistic decay and disorder to installations. Perfectly maintained equipment arranged in geometrically precise patterns would appear suspicious. Real military units are messy. Equipment is maintained but shows wear. Positions are logical but imperfect. Soldiers make minor mistakes in parking vehicles or positioning camouflage. British teams deliberately introduced these imperfections. Some inflatable tanks were positioned slightly incorrectly, as if the crew had parked carelessly. Some camouflage netting had gaps, as if hastily installed. Some positions showed more ground disturbance than others, as if they had been occupied longer. These imperfections made the installations more convincing by making them appear less carefully staged. The radio deception teams faced similar operational challenges. Maintaining consistent fictional communications networks for months required discipline and creativity. Operators had to avoid patterns that might reveal deception. Real military communications include mistakes, corrections, repeated transmissions, informal chatter, and procedural variations. British operators deliberately introduced these elements. They made occasional transmission errors. They repeated messages when simulating poor reception. They included informal elements in communications, brief conversations that weren't operationally significant, but added human texture suggesting real soldiers operating radios rather than professional intelligence operatives executing scripted broadcasts. The sophistication of this radio deception exceeded anything attempted previously in military history. British signals specialists were essentially performing improvisational theatre across hundreds of hours of broadcasts, creating a coherent fictional reality that multiple characters inhabited consistently. The fictional personnel had to have consistent personalities, make consistent decisions, and maintain consistent relationships with other fictional personnel. Headquarters commanders had to issue orders that subordinate units would acknowledge and execute. Supply officers had to request material that arrived and was distributed. Training officers had to schedule exercises that units conducted. The entire apparatus of military administration had to function in radio transmissions exactly as it would function in a real organization. German signals intelligence specialists monitoring these transmissions detected nothing suspicious. The traffic patterns, volume, encryption practices, and operational content all matched what they expected from a real army group. Some German analysts later claimed they had suspected deception but were overruled. A face-saving claim contradicted by captured documents and ultra-intercepts that show German intelligence expressing high confidence in FUSAG's reality until weeks after D-Day. The agent network's contribution to the deception deserves particular emphasis because it demonstrated British counterintelligence superiority. Every German agent in Britain was British-controlled, but German intelligence believed they were operating an extensive independent network. This meant British intelligence could feed German intelligence any narrative they wanted, confident it would be believed because it came from sources Germany considered reliable and independent. Garbo's network alone filed over 300 messages in the months before D-Day, describing FUSAG preparations in granular detail. His sub-agents supposedly observed specific units, noted unit insignia, overheard soldiers discussing operations, witnessed equipment being loaded, and reported details that seemed impossible to fabricate. German intelligence cross-referenced these reports with other sources and found perfect correlation, because British intelligence had designed all sources to corroborate each other. The British even staged elaborate deceptions to support agent credibility. In one case, an agent reported observing a specific division embarking at a specific port for what he believed was an invasion at a specific date. British deception planners arranged for the division's insignia to be visible at that port. for equipment loading activities to occur on schedule, and for radio traffic to suggest imminent departure. German intelligence, receiving this report days before the supposed invasion date, placed forces on high alert. The invasion never came because it was fictional, but the agent's credibility increased because his report correlated with other intelligence suggesting major operations were imminent. After D-Day, British deception planners faced a new challenge. Maintaining FUSAG's credibility while Allied forces were engaged in Normandy required explaining why the supposedly larger force at Calais hadn't yet invaded. The solution was tactical brilliance. Agent networks reported that FUSAG's invasion had been postponed to allow Normandy forces to draw German reserves westward, after which FUSAG would strike the weakened Calais defences. This explanation made strategic sense from a German perspective, and aligned with what German intelligence believed about Allied planning. It gave FUSAG a plausible reason for remaining inactive while maintaining its threat. British signals specialists adjusted radio traffic patterns to match this supposed postponement. Communications shifted from invasion preparation to training and maintenance, suggesting FUSAG was waiting rather than deploying. New equipment was added to southeastern England installations, suggesting FUSAG was being reinforced for a larger operation. Agent reports described troop morale issues due to the postponement, adding human texture that made the explanation more convincing. The deception continued convincing German intelligence partly because German commanders desperately wanted it to be true. The alternative, that they had held back decisive reserves to defend against armies that didn't exist while real Allied forces established an unbreakable beachhead, was too humiliating to accept without overwhelming contrary evidence. German officers reviewing intelligence about FUSAG found it easier to believe Calais remained threatened than to accept they had been catastrophically deceived. This wishful thinking extended the deception's effective life, far beyond what British planners had considered possible. By late July 1944, the evidence that FUSAG was fictional had become overwhelming. Allied forces in Normandy had advanced far beyond what would be possible if they were merely a preliminary operation. No second invasion had materialized at Calais, despite optimal conditions for such an operation. Reconnaissance of southeastern England showed equipment remaining in positions for weeks without movement, suggesting it wasn't operational. German intelligence finally concluded FUSAG had been a deception, but the conclusion came too late to influence the Normandy campaign's outcome. The post-war analysis by German officers revealed the deception's comprehensive nature and their complete failure to detect it. General Alfred Jodl, captured and interrogated after Germany's surrender, stated that German intelligence had been convinced by multiple independent sources that FUSAG was real and that Calais would be invaded. He described the realization that these supposedly independent sources were all British-controlled as shocking and professionally devastating. Other German officers interviewed after the war admitted they had never encountered deception on this scale and had no framework for evaluating whether intelligence from multiple sources might be coordinated fabrication rather than independent verification. The lessons from Operation Fortitude transcended World War II and influenced intelligence and counterintelligence doctrine permanently. The operation demonstrated that perception could be manufactured systematically using coordinated information operations. It proved that intelligence analysis remains vulnerable to deception when analysts cannot verify source independence. It showed that controlling the enemy's intelligence environment provides strategic advantages exceeding the cost of the control operation. Modern military deception doctrine acknowledges fortitude as the foundational case study for strategic information operations. The principle that manufactured perception can substitute for reality if maintained systematically and confirmed through multiple controlled sources has become central to military planning. Contemporary conflicts regularly feature deception operations where forces position decoys, generate false communications, and feed disinformation to enemy intelligence services, all applying lessons Britain learned while manufacturing fake armies faster and more convincingly than Germany could deploy real ones. The cost-effectiveness calculation remains stunning. British investment in Fortitude South, including inflatable equipment, radio deception operations, agent network management, and coordination infrastructure, totaled under $500,000. This investment paralyzed German forces, representing over $2 billion in equipment and training costs for 7 critical weeks. The return on investment exceeded 4,000 to 1, making strategic deception the most cost-effective military capability Britain employed during World War II. The human cost comparison proved equally dramatic. D-Day casualties, tragic as they were, remained far below projections. Military planners had prepared for catastrophic losses if German reserves counterattacked immediately. The forces held at Calais by the FUSAG deception represented the striking power that could have made D-Day the disaster Allied planners feared. Instead, those forces waited for an invasion that would never come, while real Allied armies established the beachhead that led to Germany's defeat. The forgotten heroes of Fortitude were not soldiers storming beaches or pilots engaging enemy aircraft. They were intelligence officers crafting deception narratives, film professionals constructing inflatable tanks, radio operators broadcasting fictional communications, and counterintelligence specialists managing agent networks. These men and women worked in anonymity, often not knowing the full scope of the operation they supported, executing mundane tasks that collectively created strategic effects exceeding many celebrated military victories. Lieutenant Colonel David Strangeways, who commanded FUSAG's physical deception component, later described the operation as the most boring war service imaginable. Months of maintaining inflatable equipment and ensuring reconnaissance aircraft photographed convincing installations. Yet his work contributed directly to saving thousands of Allied lives by keeping German reserves away from Normandy during its most vulnerable phase. The tedium of maintaining deception for months required discipline that combat operations rarely demanded, sustained attention to detail across hundreds of small decisions that collectively created strategic illusion. British intelligence officers who managed the double agent networks faced even more delicate challenges. They had to maintain agent credibility with German intelligence while advancing Allied deception goals, ensuring messages seemed authentic while containing information supporting Fortitude. They had to track multiple fictional personalities, maintain consistent character traits and knowledge levels, and avoid inconsistencies that might expose the deception. The psychological complexity of this work, essentially writing collaborative fiction that enemy intelligence would analyze professionally, required creativity and analytical rigor rarely combined in military operations. The radio operators broadcasting as fictional FUSAG units performed hundreds of hours of transmissions, creating a fictional organization through communications alone. Their work required technical expertise in radio operation, deep understanding of military organization and procedures, and improvisational skill to maintain character consistency across months of broadcasts. These operators created what was essentially performance art that enemy intelligence analyzed as factual data, a form of military theatre where the audience was an enemy intelligence service and the script was improvised daily based on strategic requirements. Ultra's contribution to Fortitude deserves recognition as perhaps the operation's most critical enabling capability. Without Ultra, British deception planners would have been working blind, unable to verify whether their deception was succeeding or failing. Ultra provided real-time feedback that transformed deception from educated guesswork into precision operation. When German intelligence expressed confidence in FUSAG, British planners knew to maintain their approach. When German intelligence questioned specific details, British planners adjusted their deception to address those concerns. This feedback loop created unprecedented deception efficiency. The mathematical impact of Operation Fortitude can be calculated with reasonable precision. German 15th Army comprised approximately 150,000 troops, 2,000 artillery pieces, 800 armoured vehicles, and supporting infrastructure. These forces remained at Calais from June 6 through late July, approximately 7 weeks. During this period, they conducted no offensive operations, engaged no Allied forces, and contributed nothing to Germany's defensive effort in Normandy. The opportunity cost of this idleness was measurable in battles not fought, positions not defended, counterattacks not launched. Military historians analysing Normandy's first week consistently identify the absence of immediate German reserves as decisive for Allied success. The forces at Calais, if committed to Normandy on D-Day, could have reached the beachhead within 24 hours. 2 full-strength panzer divisions attacking Allied positions while they remained vulnerable could have achieved breakthrough to the beaches, potentially catastrophic Allied losses, an operational delay that might have prevented successful invasion in 1944. The strategic consequences of such a failure would have extended the war, increased casualties on all sides, and potentially altered the post-war political settlement. Instead, those forces defended against inflatable tanks. They maintained defensive positions, awaiting an invasion that would never come. They consumed fuel, ammunition, and supplies, while contributing nothing to Germany's war effort. The inefficiency from Germany's perspective was total and absolute. Every resource invested in defending Calais against FUSAG was wasted. Every soldier positioned there was unavailable for combat elsewhere. Every tank, artillery piece, and supply truck at Calais represented capability frozen by deception. Britain proved that in modern warfare, where intelligence shapes operational decisions, controlling what the enemy perceives can be more decisive than controlling what actually exists. FUSAG never fired a shot, never occupied territory, never engaged enemy forces, yet its impact on World War II's outcome exceeded many real combat operations. The Phantom Army achieved strategic effects through pure information manipulation, demonstrating that perception warfare could deliver results physical warfare required massive resource investment to achieve. The principle validated by Fortitude remains relevant in contemporary conflict, where information operations, cyber warfare, and electronic deception play increasing roles. Military forces invest substantial resources in electronic warfare capabilities, decoy systems, and information operations precisely because Fortitude demonstrated that manufacturing enemy perception can be more cost-effective than manufacturing combat capability. Modern armies deploy inflatable decoys, broadcast false communications, and maintain deception operations exactly as Britain did in 1944, applying lessons learned from history's most successful strategic deception. The ultimate lesson from Operation Fortitude transcends military doctrine and speaks to fundamental truths about intelligence, perception, and decision-making under uncertainty. Intelligence analysis requires inferring reality from fragments of information. Analysts cannot observe complete truth. They must interpret evidence, correlate sources, and construct conclusions based on incomplete data. This analytical process remains vulnerable to systematic deception by adversaries who understand how analysis works and can manufacture evidence that analysis will accept as valid. Britain understood this vulnerability and exploited it perfectly. They didn't create impossible illusions that required analysts to suspend disbelief. They created plausible illusions that fit analysts' existing frameworks, that confirmed rather than challenged assumptions that seemed to be independently verified when sources were actually coordinated. The deception succeeded because it gave German intelligence exactly what they expected to find, presented through multiple sources they believed were independent, maintained consistently over months, and adjusted in response to German reactions observed through Ultra. The cost of Germany's failure to detect this deception was measured in strategic defeat. The forces that should have defended Normandy defended against balloons. The tanks that should have counterattacked the beachhead waited for a Phantom Army. The artillery that should have bombarded landing zones remained positioned to defend against inflatable threats. German defeat in Normandy, while influenced by multiple factors including Allied material superiority and German strategic errors, was decisively shaped by intelligence deception that kept German reserves frozen at Calais during the critical period when they could have changed history. Operation Fortitude demonstrated that Britain had mastered a new form of warfare. Not combat through physical force, but strategic effect through information manipulation. They manufactured armies faster than Germany could deploy real ones, because manufactured armies required only rubber, radio broadcasts, and systematic intelligence coordination. They won battles without fighting because the enemy defended against threats that didn't exist. They achieved victory through creativity, systematic planning, and understanding that in modern warfare, what the enemy believes can matter more than what actually exists. In the final analysis, the lesson is simple but profound. Britain proved that fake armies win wars if the enemy believes they're real. Germany defended against 150,000 rubber soldiers, while 150,000 real soldiers landed elsewhere. The cheapest weapon of World War II turned out to be a balloon that looked like a Sherman tank. And the most decisive strategic victory wasn't won through firepower or maneuver, but through understanding that in an age of long-range reconnaissance and signals intelligence, perception is reality until someone proves otherwise. By the time Germany proved FUSAG was fiction, the war in the West was already lost, decided not on battlefields, but in intelligence offices where British deception planners had won the only battle that mattered, the battle for German commanders' minds.